Thanks, Dan. Well, as you can see here at Restoration HQ, blue skies and sunshine abound, and one man's battle with a very rusty Range Rover continues. Reporting live for SCM TV as the shit show unfolds, I'm George Corellis. Back to studio. If I have any chance of conveying to you what it was like when the horrors unfolded that you'll see later on, we first have to work through all the little jobs that stood between us and the first start of this car, which is what I thought this episode was going to be. We had the front end just offered up as a test fit, and no sooner had I dismantled it than the rain started yet again. I didn't get too fussy about leaving the cover off. I thought, this is going to be a passing shower, we've got to keep going. It was a great feeling though to see the water sit proud and beat off all the fresh paint. So with camera protected, on I went, and it wasn't long before I found myself back in the shed, just trying to do any little job to keep forward momentum. The bonnet hinges got the first bit of attention. I drifted out the pins, it's as simple as that, greased them and let them back in. And they went from being extremely stiff to being completely free. Bumpers next. The front bumper's in two sections, the front air dam and the bumper itself, and all of this has suffered badly, as you might imagine. The ends of the bumpers are rusted out. On one end of the front bumper, the actual support bar for the corner overriders is toast, so I've got to fabricate and replace that. Even the bolts are destroyed just by the act of taking them out. This will also need attention to the front fog light mounts. Just everything needs to be sanded back, wire brushed and painted. And welding, of course. I mean, that goes without saying, right? As soon as there was any sign of a patch of blue sky, I was straight back out, but with the cover ready to go at the drop of a hat. Water is pooling in the scuttle, which is great news. I mean, if the car was moving, this water would be run out either end. But right in the centre, there was a conspicuously dry patch. And I was worried that this is because the water had been there and had seeped into the car. So I did a little test. And at the time, I thought, this is inconclusive. I wasn't sure if it was just the water settling, you know, the meniscus of the water just running down slightly. But I watched it for about 10 minutes and it didn't really drop appreciably. So hopefully we're okay. Making final preparations for the wings to go on, the offside rail for the wing that holds it, that went in. Now one of the things that test fitting was for were these under arch liners, and I had to make sure we had enough mounting holes for them. This is the underneath of the near side inner wing of a Range Rover Classic. There are all sorts of things bolted to this inner wing, hence all the holes. And yes, I'm here to make more. And so on to painting the final overcoat of black paint. Now, I've used black off the shelf metal and wood overcoat paint, you know, and I would never use it again. It's not that it's bad, it's just not really for this job. This is all very, so you can't see what's going on here, but there is fresh paint moving across all of these panels. This will last a long time because there are two layers of a decent primer. The paint on the underside of this car is now very thick. And of course, no sooner had I gone across the top of the scuttle than it started to spit rain again. And what was a few spits of rain gradually started to get worse, and I could see some fairly heavy stuff on the way. So I jerry-rigged this kind of canopy over the front of the car, and I only just had it finished when the temperature dropped and it started to hail heavily. Luckily there was no wind, so we got away with this. And underneath, all of the paint stayed unscathed, and we're really getting that spring weather. All of it. Did we dare pull the covers back? I didn't. I decided let's do stuff that's kind of semi-outside. And I pulled out the boot floor because it's full of holes that aren't supposed to be in it. But also, something I mentioned before, the mounting holes, the tie-down holes where it will be riveted, they were in the wrong place on this car. Somehow it doesn't line up. Now, it's not the right floor for the car, and that's how. But I would have expected that it would have lined up. Something I'd ordered a while back had arrived. A kit for aluminium brazing. Now there are loads of videos of this on the internet, but it's something that people generally don't seem to try. And I wanted to know how effective it was, because the videos online for these aluminium rods, they're like infomercials almost, you know, they do that whole, this couldn't be easier, and they hammer on the repairs afterwards to show how durable they are. So I really wanted to figure it out for myself. And it's supposed to be as simple as heating the parent metal, getting a good heat into it, and then letting the parent metal heat the aluminium rod. These rods are designed to have a lower melting point than normal aluminium, whatever alloy they are, and high surface tension. And I've left this fully in real time because I'm actually being too nervous about what I'm doing here. I could have done this a lot quicker, and I did do the rest of the repairs a lot quicker. As I said, you heat the parent metal and then you bring in the aluminium rod. I should have been keeping it closer so that it was getting warmed too, and then this whole process would have been faster. But then when it does start to go, you just drag it across the repair, drag it across the hole. And this hole here is your average kind of 4 or 5 mil hole, but I have bridged far bigger gaps with this since. The surface tension of it is incredible, and if you're careful with your application of heat, it's amazing what's possible here. I could imagine that with a far more precise blowtorch, you could do far more precise work. And check out these repairs. Now, what I really should have done was cleaned the back side of the panel first, just to have a conscientious repair. And the trick to this whole repair is a perfectly clean repair area. I did have a few repairs fall out because I got complacent and I hadn't cleaned them properly. So this is just an off-the-shelf plumber's torch from the hardware store with MAP gas. MAP gas will do this, no problem. And the rods come with this little stainless steel wire brush. You don't use a mild steel wire brush on aluminium. It's not right for the prep. It doesn't get it clean enough, and I think it leaves some sort of residue. And I didn't think it was going to be up to much, but it's actually incredible. It doesn't deform easily, and it really gets in and cleans very effectively. This stuff grinds nicely too. I'm not taking it back flush because it's not welded. It relies on gripping the surface of the parent metal, so thinning it out isn't a good idea. As I was doing this, yes, it started to rain again, and I just kept going. It wasn't heavy rain. I was in my overalls. And by the way, I've talked about these things before. I'll talk about them again. What allows me to keep working through cold and through light showers like this are these overalls. They're way too big for me, but I found that's incredible. They've got plenty of space in them all over, and it means they go on over shoes and they leave room for white boy moves. While I went, I didn't notice, but we were getting a bit too much heat into the panel and it has warped, but it's fine, and it'll pin down flat, no problem. This panel is almost ready for prep and paint, save for a quick check underneath to mark where the new rivet holes need to be and to make sure the seatbelt anchors will line up. All good. I marked the boot floor for where the rails actually travel across underneath it, where it will be pinned down, and drilled new holes. Reassuringly, where I drilled through the repair metal, there was no cracking or falling out, and it's good and thick too. The amount of swarf is proof of that. Everything now will line up underneath, including the seatbelt anchor points. On those, there are some rubbers that go into the mounts on the chassis. I cleaned the chassis while I was at it too. It's such a shame. All our lovely clean paintwork has been marred by all the swarf that has slowly rusted. But all we can do is keep going. When I did finally get to take the cover back off the car, reassuringly, there was a large pool of water in that centre section of the scuttle. So good news. Hopefully it wasn't just the extra layer of paint that has sealed any tiny pinholes. So, under a little bit of sunshine and blue sky, we're ready to put the scuttle equipment back together. First is the cover panel that holds the resistors for the heating system. This was factory sealed with what I think is butyl tape. Well, that's what I'm going to use to seal it anyway. You get this from the builder providers or a good hardware store, and it comes coiled up in a backing tape. It's extremely sticky. If it comes in contact with itself, it's for keeps, so be warned. It's kind of a black rubber, but it will hold any shape you give it rather than springing back to the shape it has memorized. You can be quite rough with this stuff because it's almost like putty when you've peeled the backing tape off, and you can kind of mould it afterwards. On the offside, that same aperture in the scuttle holds the wiper motor and mechanism. It has its own kind of rubber gaiter, this panel, so you don't need butyl tape on that. At least I hope you don't. And every mounting point has a almost metallastic bush kind of a deal going on with a small cylindrical metal insert. Make sure you've got the right size ones in the right places because they are different sizes. And don't forget them. With the panel back in, all that's left is to actually assemble the mechanism, and it's just a case of spring washers and circlips. And to the main event. This is something I wasn't sure I'd be able to do alone, the spring system on the bonnet hinges. It's a torsion bar setup and there is a fair amount of spring rate here. It's not too much for one guy, but it's borderline for one guy trying to do something tricky with one hand while counteracting the spring rate with the other. There was a real danger of these springing back and hitting the windscreen. So let's throw our wings on. Both driver and passenger go on with no bother. The electric aerial, I had started to cut out of the wing, and then I realised I didn't want to cut the aerial wire itself. I soldered what I had cut back together, and hopefully that still works. So our scuttle is complete. Now this is a problem panel in the sense that I reckon they must have put the windscreens in after fitting the scuttle at the factory, because it just seems impossible to do without tearing up the paint of the scuttle under panel. Okay, to the rear, Batman. The fuel tank is held in by a cradle. It sits on a cradle, so in that goes. What I'm going to do here is brush a coat of that cavity wax just onto the top side of that cradle. It should have at least a couple more years service in it. Now, I had a crisp memory of taking this tank out from the top, and I couldn't understand why it wouldn't go back in until I went back and watched the episode that I took it out in and realised there was no rear cross member in the car when I pulled the tank out, so of course it came out the top, no problem. I had to drop not only the cradle I just put in, but also the anti-roll bar to get this tank back in. We've come a long way. I couldn't figure out why the fuel tank wiring didn't seem to sit naturally, or how an earth wire had gone missing, and a day or two later I remembered there'd been a loom extension that I disconnected and moved out of the way, and I had forgotten about. But back in it went, and on go the pipes that link it to the fuel filler neck. We are rounding the last few corners, the few little bits and pieces on the car, the little detail jobs that need to be done before it's complete again. And I moved on to the bonnet, which I knew had some surface rust on it. And from the experience which I've now gained from this whole saga, I kind of figured they would be a bit worse than surface rust. And sure enough they were. So I cut out what I had to. This bonnet, when I started this job I figured this bonnet's a waste of time. But having done some work on it, it's not really. It's not going to be a perfect bonnet ever again. But it's got some service life left in it. So I wire brushed the whole inside of it, prepped it with some primer just where I'd peeled the paint off it, and tackled quite a bit of filler work over the repairs that I'd done. And I have to say, small areas of filler work like this where there is a bit of a curve or a corner or some kind of detail, I think they're actually almost easier than a flat panel because there's a very definite shape that you're trying to mimic, that you're trying to restore. There's a focus almost, and that's easier for the eye to follow than a piece of flat metal that has probably 2 or 3 different colours of paint showing through and then the filler. So with the repairs pretty much ready for their paint, I thought I'd give the underside of the bonnet a coat of matte black. You couldn't put gloss on the underside of a bonnet, it just wouldn't look right, would it? More details, the brake lines. They travelled through those 2 outriggers we fabricated and replaced underneath the driver and passenger footwell. and in getting the unions freed off, it was obvious the unions themselves were toast. The original fittings had those kind of star-shaped, spiked locking washers. I couldn't find them, and I hadn't ordered any new ones, so I got what I had, which were some more conventional stainless steel ones. Now these are too strong for the 1mm thread on the connector. I didn't want to strip the threads, so I crushed the washers slightly in the vise, and that made a hell of a difference. It doesn't look like it, but it took a lot of the force out of them. But we're not ready to cinch these up yet, because as you can see, we've still got some painting to do, and I dare say we need to replace those flat washers with some new ones too. Okay, while that's drying, to the inside of the car and the wiring loom coming from the doors back inside. All those connectors go back in. Staying on the passenger side, I reseated this control unit, and as I went to screw this array of relays to a bracket underneath the seat, I noticed how dirty they were. Now I hadn't noticed this before, but everything here had been caked, absolutely pressed full of grease, obviously to keep water or moisture out of these electrics. What a mess. I'm beyond being surprised by anything on this car, or so I thought, and a 30-second job turned into a good 45 minutes of prep work and cleaning. On the driver's side, finally the ECU goes back in, relays go back where they should, and that door loom gets reconnected. Now on both sides there was one multi-plug that had no counterpart that I could find underneath the dash. So I refitted the trim panels, and if we have something that isn't working then we'll have to investigate more fully. Now, about being immune to any more surprises on this car, the very last thing before I could refit the seats and the rest of the interior was something I had known about from the very beginning. The moisture rising from inside the footwells had been condensing on the sunroof, and then with the curve of the roof was running forward on the glass and had started to rot out the frame of the sunroof itself. I had a replacement sunroof right from the very beginning of this build, and the last thing that was holding me back from fitting the interior was just pulling that sunroof out, replacing the cassette, and getting on with my life. So I pulled the headlining. Start with the sun visors, they hold it at its leading edge, then the grab rails. The interior light at the back is another support point, and the rear speakers complete the picture. So the headlining is quite a robust thing. It seems to have a fiberglass skeleton, and with that gone, we can pull the sunroof cassette. It's held in by nuts on captive bolts in the ceiling, and while you're releasing those, you also need to take the drain tubes off them, which are held on by some clips, and of course the wiring loom. Aside from the sunroof assembly being fairly heavy, it's a very easy job. And when I got that safely down out of the ceiling, I had a quick look around, and my eyes were assaulted. The upper windscreen frame, or what was the upper windscreen frame, was being held in place by the windscreen rubber. I have come too far to scrap this car, but I have to say, I genuinely thought about it when I saw this. I just thought, I can't deal with any more rust. But this has to be the end of it. There is nowhere else on this car for rust to hide. After a couple of hours of hard sulking to get over this, I spent a bit of time on the computer, made a few calls, and the next day found myself cutting a replacement panel out of a roof section in the garden of another Range Rover fan. And as soon as I fit this, the interior will go back into this car, and I will be turning the key in the ignition, and it better flipping start. Those were the final small details, the little jobs that needed to be done before I could bolt a seat back in this thing and give starting it a go for the first time in nearly 4 years. So you can imagine it was a very exciting morning and a very big kick in the teeth when I found that rust in the windscreen surround. And what can you do? You just have to try and keep going. And I will, as soon as this all blows over. 2 new patrons, James Barrett, John Mason, GP, Ben, Diogo Carvalho, Paul, Eden and Terry Wright. Thank you for your support. Thank you to all my patrons and for the ongoing motivation that you're bringing me. I will see you very soon as this blows over. Until then, please do like, subscribe and share with a pal. And if you'd like to support the series, there are links in the description. I'll see you soon. Get back on that project and make it happen. Good luck.